In 1986, Tom Hawks was a 39-year-old father of two teenage boys. He had previously been married to his boys' mother, but they had ultimately gotten a divorce. That year, Tom and his two sons were at this local chili cook-off in their neighborhood in Newport Beach, California, when Tom was looking out across the sea of people and he sees this stunningly beautiful woman he's never seen before, and he just finds himself staring at her. And he stares at her so long that this woman, she ends up noticing, and she looks up and kind of smiles and blushes and looks away. And Tom immediately is totally embarrassed because he just got caught staring at her. And so he decides, you know what, I got to go over there and introduce myself. And so Tom, who's this totally ruggedly handsome, muscular guy with this incredible mustache, he strides across the lawn and he walks up to this woman and he introduces himself. And she is all smiles and she says her name is Jackie and she's 29 years old and she's single. And from that point onward, those two completely hit it off. They fell madly in love. And just a few years later, in 1989, they got married in front of 150 of their closest friends and family. And then after the wedding, Jackie moved in with Tom and his two boys. And even though the boys' mother was still alive, they began calling Jackie Mom, because Jackie not only lived with them, but also because she was so devoted to them, and she just was such a loving and kind person that it just made sense to do that. Also, Jackie, when she was 22 years old, she had gotten into this horrific motorcycle accident, and the internal damage that accident had done to her had left her unable to have kids of her own, something she had always wanted to do. And so when she had the opportunity to be these boys' mother, she really leaned into it. And so she was like this fabulous mother. So over the years, Tom and Jackie raised their two sons, and then in 2002, when the boys were all grown up, they left the house. Now, this was a sad moment for Tom and Jackie to suddenly be empty nesters. I mean, so much of their identity was wrapped up in being parents, and they were very close with their sons. But at the same time, they knew this day was coming, and they had actually been preparing for it for several years. They had been putting money aside every single year to prepare for when their sons left, because they wanted to time it so they could retire at the same time. And their idea of retirement was to go buy a yacht and just live on the yacht and sail up and down the California and Mexican coastline. Now, neither Jackie nor Tom were wealthy at all. However, they were very good at saving money and they were very disciplined and they could live frugally. And so over the past couple of years, they really had saved virtually every penny so they could afford to buy this yacht. And so finally in 2002, when their sons do actually leave, Tom and Jackie, they sell their house in Newport Beach, California. And between the proceeds from the sale of their house and all this money they had set aside, they had enough to purchase this kind of beat up old small yacht. And so this yacht they named the Well-Deserved. Even though this yacht was by no means a glamorous yacht like you think of when you hear that word, Tom and Jackie adored this boat. And so as soon as it was theirs and they had docked it in Newport, they moved all of their belongings onto this boat because they're going to live on this boat. And then they began meticulously cleaning it and organizing it and upgrading it everywhere they could within their limited budget. And by the summer of that year, this boat was beautiful, both on the outside and the inside. It was very cozy and very clearly had the touch of Tom and Jackie. It was a home. And so for the next 2 years, Tom and Jackie, they lived the dream. They took that yacht and just sailed up and down the coast of California and Mexico, and they would watch these beautiful sunsets, and they would catch fresh fish, and they would drink cocktails together. I mean, they were really enjoying their retirement. Then, in 2004, they got some unexpected news. One of their sons told them that he was now expecting to be a father. And so this baby was going to be the first grandchild of Tom and Jackie, and they were so excited. Especially Jackie, because remember, she wasn't able to have kids of her own, and she just loved the idea of getting to be motherly again, and the idea of getting to hold this precious little baby. And so even though Tom and Jackie were absolutely loving living out on this yacht, they decided that the time was right to actually sell the yacht and then take the proceeds from the sale of the yacht and buy a house on land to be closer to their son and this grandbaby. So in November of that year, the Hawks place an ad in this fishing magazine for the sale of their yacht. They were asking for about $500,000. And very quickly after this ad went live, this young couple who had saved up some cash, they offered to buy it. Tom and Jackie were totally thrilled and they called their two sons to tell them the good news news that they had this buyer and that in the next couple of days, the sale would be finalized and then they would be in touch. And so the sons, they're expecting to get a phone call from Tom and Jackie any day, but a couple of days goes by and they haven't heard from them. And so the sons begin calling their parents and their parents aren't picking up their phone. Now, Tom and Jackie were not the type to go any amount of time without being in touch with their family. And so this was very uncharacteristic. And so when Tom's brother, Jim, who was a retired police chief, when he heard about this sudden silence, he just got in his car and drove to Newport Beach, California to see if maybe they had not finalized the sale of the yacht and maybe the couple was still on the yacht and he could go check in with them and make sure everything was okay. And so Jim, along with a friend of his, they arrive in Newport Beach, they make their way to the dock where the yacht was being held, and they go down to the floating section of the dock and they walk right up alongside the well-deserved, and just from where they're standing, it does not seem like anyone is on the yacht. However, as they're standing there just kind of looking at this yacht right in front of them, Jim notices a couple of oddities. He sees there are lines hanging over the side of the boat that should have been stowed. And Tom was known for being incredibly meticulous and orderly. I mean, that yacht was spick and span always. And so he would not have left these lines draped over the edge of the boat unless he was on board, and he wasn't. And so Jim's also looking around and he sees there are a couple of tarps that go over some of the control panels that had been taken off, but then not put back on the control panels. And so again, that's not something Tom or Jackie would have done. And then there's also some dirty towels kind of hanging out of one of the portholes. And so overall, the impression Jim and this friend got was, I guess they must have finalized the sale of this yacht, because clearly the new owners of this boat, they're the ones that are in possession of it, and they're the reason it's sloppy, because Tom and Jackie, they never would leave the boat in this condition. And so Jim pulls out his own business card and he writes a note on it that he's looking to speak with the new owners of this boat because his brother and his brother's wife had sold this boat to them, but now they're missing. And so please give me a call back. And so Jim and his friend, they leave the boat, they leave the dock, and they begin to leave the area when Jim's cell phone rings. And he picks it up, and it's this 21-year-old woman named Jennifer De Leon. And so she tells Jim that she got his business card on her yacht, and that yes, she and her husband had recently purchased this yacht from the Hawks, but like Jim, they were having a hard time getting in touch with the Hawks as well, because after acquiring their boat, Jennifer said she and her husband realized there were a couple of controls on the boat that they didn't know how to use, and so they needed to talk to Tom and Jackie to explain how to use them. Also, Jennifer said she had found some personal belongings that belonged to Tom and Jackie that were stuffed in a couple of drawers that just got left behind, and so she wanted to return that property to them as well. But she's telling Jim, I'm trying to get in touch with them and I can't get in touch with them. And so Jim asked Jennifer, when was the last time you or your husband saw Tom or Jackie? And she would say, the last time we saw them was when we actually finalized the sale of the boat, when we literally gave them the money and we watched them take the money, hop in their car, and drive away. Jim asked her if she had any idea where they might have been going. And Jennifer said, we really didn't have that many personal conversations with Tom or Jackie. It was mostly just business stuff. But in the limited personal interactions we did have, Tom would always talk about how he and Jackie planned on buying a house in Mexico in this town that bordered Arizona, because apparently they have a son that lives in Arizona and he's about to have a baby, and they were talking about how they wanted to be very close. Jim thanked Jennifer and asked her, if you hear from Tom or Jackie, please let me know. And then Jennifer says to Jim, same thing to you. If you hear from them, please let me know, because I need to talk to them too. And so they hang up, and Jim is left thinking, what's going on here? And then Jim remembers there's this woman that Tom and Jackie had hired. Her name was Patricia. And for the past couple of years that they had been out on their boat, they knew they would not have great internet. And so they would not be able to consistently be able to pay their bills and pay taxes. And so they had hired this woman, Patricia, who was also a friend of theirs, to basically pay their bills and manage their finances. And so Jim gets her number and he calls Patricia. And the first thing he asks her is, hey, have you spoken with Tom or Jackie recently? And she says, no, I haven't. And so Jim explains the situation and then asks Patricia, has Tom or Jackie recently made a large deposit into any of their accounts? Because just a couple of days ago, they would have received nearly $500,000. And so Patricia, she checks the accounts and she says, no, there's been no deposits made. And so Jim and Patricia are talking on the phone, trying to rationalize why Tom and Jackie would not have deposited so much money and they really couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation for it. And so after Jim hung up with Patricia, he just had a bad feeling about what was going on. And so Jim called the Newport Beach Police Department, and he officially reported Tom and Jackie missing. The first thing the Newport Beach Police Department did with this missing person report was to do some digging on the new buyers of this yacht, the De Leons. And when they looked at the 25-year-old husband named Skyler, they discovered he was a felon. He had been arrested and convicted of armed robbery and had spent some time in jail for it. And so naturally, the police were immediately suspicious of Skyler De Leon, and really the De Leons in general, because they were the last ones to see the Hawks before they went missing. And so they sent one of their detectives down to the dock to just kind of walk around the yacht and just kind of feel it out, see what's going on down there, see if there's anything unusual. And so this detective goes down to the dock, they walk onto the floating section of the dock, and they walk right up alongside the well-deserved. And from the looks of it, it doesn't appear that anybody's on board. And as this detective is kind of looking in the window and just kind of looking around, they think they see what looks like a bloody handprint inside the boat. And so that would end up being enough to get a search warrant. And before long that day, there were police swarming this boat, looking all over it. But it would turn out that was not a bloody handprint. It was actually just some rust. And there was nothing else of significance that was found on board this boat. And so the police are pretty frustrated because they really don't have any leads. And so they contact Skyler De Leon and they say, hey, you need to come into the police station and explain exactly what happened during your final interaction with the Hawks. And so Skyler comes to the police station, he's totally cooperative, and he explains to the detectives that, he saw this ad in this fishing magazine for a yacht. He contacted Tom Hawk and said, I'm interested. The two of them met up and then went out for a sea trial, which is basically a test drive, but for a boat. And during the sea trial, Skyler told Tom that he liked the boat and he wanted to go forward with the purchase. And so on November 15th, Skyler, along with his pregnant wife and his young daughter, and also a notary and another person, a friend of Skyler's that was there just kind of as a witness, they go to the parking lot of the dock right near where the yacht is. And then the Hawks show up, Tom and Jackie, and the De Leons literally hand over a suitcase full of cash to Tom, and then Tom and Jackie, with the notary, they signed the sale documentation, basically giving the boat over to the De Leons. And then Tom and Jackie took their suitcase full of cash, hopped in their SUV, and they drove off, presumably to go to Mexico. When the police asked Skyler, how were you able to afford such an expensive vessel? Skyler would tell them that back in the 1990s, he was actually a child star, or kind of. He was an extra on the very popular TV show Power Rangers, and from being on that show, he had made a bunch of money and he had set it aside. And as Skyler is telling the detectives this, he kind of just stops himself at some point and he's like, you know what? That's not really the truth. The reality is the reason we had the money to do this is not because of the cash I got from being a child star. It's actually because I stole the money. It would turn out that armed robbery that Skyler was convicted for and spent some time in jail for, that was because he was stealing money from this drug kingpin. And before he was arrested and sent off to jail, he had managed to take the money that he had stolen and hide it. And then after he had gone to jail and got out again, he came back to his hiding space and he just retrieved the money. But this money was stolen drug money, so it was hot. And so he needed to get rid of it. He needed to launder the money. And so that was why he was buying this yacht. He was going to buy it with this dirty money in bulk, in cash, and basically transform this hot, dirty money into this yacht. And then he was going to sell the yacht and get clean money for it. And so the police are totally shocked at this confession because Skyler has just completely incriminated himself in a money laundering scheme. But the police would ultimately say to Skyler, you know what, we're not going to charge you with money laundering because you're being so forthright and helpful with this investigation. And so they let Skyler go. The police would go on to interview Skyler's wife, Jennifer, as well as the notary and also that other friend who had come along for that final sale of the boat who was there as a witness. And so the police interview all three of those people and they asked them, you know, what was your final interaction with Tom and Jackie like? And they all described the same situation of seeing Tom and Jackie taking the suitcase full of cash and then signing the paperwork, hopping in their car and driving off. The only detail that seemed to differ amongst these four people who were there was the way Tom and Jackie were acting. Skylar made it seem like Tom was kind of anxious and paranoid about having all this money, whereas the notary said, Tom and Jackie seemed completely normal to me. After all the interviews with these people who had seen Tom and Jackie last, the police felt like they had kind of reached a dead end and just didn't know what to do next. And so they went to the media and asked them to put out a bulletin that had a picture of Tom and Jackie, as well as a picture of their vehicle, and it asked people to come forward if they had seen them. And sure enough, within a couple of days of this bulletin going out on TV, this older couple in Mexico called the police to say the Hawks SUV is right across the street from me right now. It's parked right on the road. And so naturally, the Mexican authorities as well as American authorities, they rush to this location and they charge up to the house where this SUV is parked, and they're kind of expecting to find Jackie and Tom inside, or someone that at least knows Tom and Jackie. But when they knock on the door, this guy nobody recognized, someone who was living in Mexico, he comes up to the door and he's looking very confused, and the police ask him, whose SUV is that parked outside? And he said, oh, well, that's my friend's car. And they say, well, is your friend Tom or Jackie Hawks? And the guy's like, no, who's that? The car belongs to Skylar De Leon. This was, of course, the moment when the police realized Skylar was lying to them. He had told police the last time he had seen Jackie and Tom, they had hopped in their SUV and they had driven off. But clearly that was not the last time, because he somehow managed to acquire their car afterwards, and then he gave it to this random person in Mexico. So the police in Newport Beach, they used Skylar's money laundering confession on camera to bring him in. They arrested him on money laundering, and then with him in custody, they searched his home. And inside of his and Jennifer's house, they found all these things that belonged to the Hawks. Things like laptops and video cameras, things Tom and Jackie would not have left behind on the boat. But despite all this evidence connecting Skylar De Leon to the Hawks' disappearance, he maintained his innocence and said this was just a big misunderstanding. And then while he was in custody getting grilled by police, his wife, Jennifer, was also saying the same thing, that Skylar didn't do anything. She was even going on talk shows and talking about how this is just one big misunderstanding and Skylar had nothing to do with the Hawks' disappearance, that they are just as concerned about Tom and Jackie as everybody else is. But the police were not buying it. They knew Skylar knew something that he wasn't telling them, obviously. However, they weren't really getting anywhere interviewing Skylar. He was just kind of saying, look, I had nothing to do with it. And so the police decide, let's go back and re-interview the notary and also that other friend who was there as a witness on that day that the final sale of the boat took place. And so they call the notary back into the police department, and the notary is this woman named Kathleen Harris, who's never gotten in trouble in her life, and she's been a very successful notary for a long time. And so she sits down and they ask her again to describe her final interactions with Tom and Jackie. And once again, she says, yep, they came over, they signed the paperwork, they took their cash, they got in their SUV, and they drove off. But under follow-on, very intensive questioning by the police, Kathleen would finally break. And she would say, actually, I've never met Tom and Jackie in my entire life. I was paid up front in cash by Skylar De Leon to backdate those sale documents that had already been signed. I have no idea what happened to Tom and Jackie. Next, the police went out and got that friend who was also there at the time of the final sale, that witness. His name was Alonzo Mason. And so they bring him in and they ask him, what was your final interaction like with Tom and Jackie? And at first he stuck to the story that, they got the cash, they hopped in the SUV, they drove off, that's all it was. And the police stop him and they're like, we just spoke to the notary and she said she was lying. She wasn't even there. She had backdated those documents. So we know you're lying. And so as soon as Alonzo got caught red-handed, he began to clam up. And it was pretty obvious he did not want to say anything else. And since the police really needed something to happen with this case, they said to Alonzo, we will make sure your sentence is heavily reduced if you tell us everything you know about what happened to Tom and Jackie. And so Alonzo says, okay, I'll tell you. Alonzo was a young guy, very impressionable. He was in his early to mid 20s, and he was actually a jailer, and he had met Skylar when Skylar was in jail. He was in jail for that armed robbery. And so after Skylar gets out of jail, Alonzo and Skylar somehow stay friends, and they spend a lot of time together. And then in November of 2004, Skylar pulls Alonzo aside, and he confesses to him that he is in fact an international assassin, that people paid him to kill people, but only bad people, Skylar said. And he says to Alonzo, I have a current contract on two really bad people, Tom and Jackie Hawks, but I need help carrying this out. And so if you will help me carry out this contract, I will give you $1 million US. And so Alonzo's like, man, okay, yeah, I'll help you. And so on November 15th, Skylar, Alonzo, and a third man that Skylar had recruited to be a part of this job. He was this big, muscular, intimidating looking guy who was actually a longtime Southern California gang member. His name was John Kennedy. Those three, they show up at the parking lot of the dock not to finalize the sale of this yacht. They weren't even close to finalizing the sale. They were there to meet up with Tom and Jackie to do a sea trial, a test drive. But when Tom and Jackie arrive, Tom, who was a longtime probation officer and so was very used to being around felons and convicts, he immediately sized these three up and thought, bad news. And so when the two parties met each other in the parking lot, Skylar started to notice that Tom was definitely apprehensive about getting on a boat with them. In fact, Tom was talking about potentially rescheduling and that, today's not a good day. And Skylar's seeing, okay, they're clearly uneasy about getting on the boat with us. And so Skylar says, hey, Tom, Jackie, hold on a minute. I'm going to step aside and make a phone call. And so Skylar steps aside and he calls his wife, Jennifer, and she was not far away. And so just a couple of minutes later, Jennifer pulls into the parking lot carrying her little 1-year-old baby girl. And as soon as she walks over to this group, the dynamic completely changes. Jackie sees this baby and she immediately falls in love with it and she wants to hold the baby and she loves Jennifer. Jennifer is so sweet. And so Jackie seems very much at ease and Tom notices that. And so Tom begins to loosen up, and before long, Tom is saying to Skylar, you know what, guys? Today's fine. Let's do the sea trial. And so the group eventually begins to make their way onto the yacht, the well-deserved, to do the sea trial. And right as they're about to get on, Jennifer says, hey guys, I can't go on the sea trial. The baby's upset. I got to go home. I'll see you guys when you get back. And at this point, Tom and Jackie, they've already committed to doing the sea trial. And so even if they were a little bit apprehensive going on this boat with just these three guys, they put their faith in the De Leons that this was on the up and up. So the two Hawks, along with these three men, they get on board the boat and they begin heading out towards open water. And so Tom was piloting the boat. And at some point when they were very far away from the dock and really any land in any direction, Skylar and John come up to Tom and they say, hey, we want to show you something down in the lower levels of the ship. And so Tom goes with them. They go downstairs into the bedroom. And while they're down there, Alonzo and Jackie were in the kitchen, which is right above the bedroom. And as they're standing there, Alonzo and Jackie suddenly hear this very loud commotion coming from the bedroom. Now, Alonzo knew what that was. It was Skylar and John attacking Tom. And so that was his cue. Alonzo leapt forward and he grabbed onto Jackie. And before Jackie could even figure out what was going on, he had thrown her to the ground, pulled her hands behind her back, and then he pulled out handcuffs that he had and he handcuffed her hands together.
Sounds like Jackie's here, Alonzo's here, and then that's where Thomas Hawks, Skylar, and JFK are on the bottom. And Jackie hears the commotion. She looks down this way, and this is where Alonzo overpowers her.
And as soon as Jackie was subdued in the kitchen, Skylar and John, they come up the stairs, and Tom's not with them, and they grab Jackie, and they walk her down into the bedroom, and Jackie would have seen her husband, Tom. He's been handcuffed, and he's laying on the bed on his back. And so they throw Jackie onto the bed right next to Tom, and immediately Jackie turns around and looks at Skylar and says, why are you doing this to us? We just met your wife. I just held your baby. Why are you doing this? All we want to do is just go back to land and be with our children and be with our grandchildren, please. But Skylar didn't care. He just turned to Alonzo and said, put tape on both of their mouths and their eyes. And as Alonzo was doing that, Skylar went upstairs and began piloting the boat towards the deepest part of the ocean. And so as Skylar is driving this boat, Alonzo and John are down in the bedroom, and Alonzo remembers looking over at Tom, and Tom was comforting Jackie. He had managed to pull his hand up and he was stroking Jackie's hand, and he was saying to her, "It's going to be okay. No matter what happens to us, we'll be together." Suddenly, the boat stopped because Skylar had reached the deepest part of the ocean, and he called down to John and Alonzo to bring Jackie and Tom up onto the deck. And so Alonzo and John do just that. They march Tom and Jackie up the steps, they bring them out to the deck of the ship, and then Skylar forces them to sign the sale documentation for the boat, as well as had them sign additional paperwork that gave Skylar access to their bank accounts. And while they were signing these documents, Jackie actually misspelled her last name on one of the signature blocks. She left the S off of her last name. That's not something she would have done by accident. It's pretty clear she did that on purpose to signal to the future that she signed this under duress. After all these documents were signed, the three men led their two captives to the back of the boat. And then once they were standing at the back of the boat, Skylar tells Alonzo, in earshot of Jackie and Tom, to, hey, go to the front of the boat and get the anchor. And so Tom and Jackie, they know that whatever's going to happen to them next, it's not good. And so Jackie begins pleading with them to let them live, let them go back to land, let them see their grandchild. And Tom manages to shake his restraints from John, who was holding him, and he manages to kick Skylar really hard in the groin. But after that, John leapt on top of Tom and Jackie and subdued both of them. And then he positioned Tom and Jackie so they were sitting down back to back with their handcuffs connected to each other. And then Alonzo shows up dragging this heavy anchor, and he finally gets it all the way over until it's right next to Tom and Jackie, at which point Skylar grabs the long metal chain that came off of the anchor, and he felt around until he got to the very end of the chain. So not the side closest to the anchor that's attached to it, the far other side, the bitter end of this chain. And he reached down and he connected that portion of the chain to Tom and Jackie's handcuffs. And then once he was sure their handcuffs were securely fastened to the end of this chain, Skylar stood up, walked over and grabbed the anchor, and with quite a bit of effort, he managed to lift it up and threw it over the side of the boat. As soon as that anchor hit the water, all Tom and Jackie would have heard for several seconds would be the sound of all of that loose chain that they were connected to being rapidly pulled off the boat and being sucked down into the water. And so that chain was going up and over this wooden railing, and so all they would have heard is just chain links grinding over the railing until finally the anchor pulled the chain tight, at which point it yanked Tom and Jackie towards the side of the boat. Alonzo would say when this happened, Jackie's head struck the inside of the side of the boat so hard it made this very loud, audible cracking sound. And then Skylar, Alonzo, and John just stood there as Tom and Jackie desperately tried to fight against the weight of this anchor that was trying to pull them off of the boat. Tom was trying to hold on to anything he could to try to hold his wife in place, but eventually the weight of this anchor combined with the movement of the boat was just too much. And so Tom and Jackie were very slowly pulled up and over and off the boat into the water. When they hit the water, they would have been fully alive, fully conscious, as they began their rapid descent to the bottom of the ocean, 3,500 feet below. Alonzo would tell police as soon as Tom and Jackie disappeared below the surface, Skylar let out a woohoo and ran over to the edge of the boat and looked into the water like a giddy child. And he was staring at where they had disappeared, and he was just grinning and laughing. And then finally, when the water went calm and there were no more bubbles, Skylar just kind of laughed, turned around, and made his way back to the cockpit and began piloting the boat back towards the dock. Even though Jennifer was not on the boat at the time of the murder, she was equally involved in it. In fact, the attack was her idea. She wanted more money, and she saw this scheme as being a way of doing that. So remember, when she showed up at the dock parking lot with her baby and put Jackie and Tom at ease to help get them out on that sea trial, she was doing that very intentionally to trap Jackie and Tom. She knew what was going to happen out on that boat. She was trying to get them to go so they could be murdered and they could steal their boat. And when Skylar was out on the boat, before, during, and after the murders, he would step aside and call Jennifer to let her know how it was going and kind of get her feedback and ask for advice about what they should do next. With that in mind, one of the darker elements of this case has to do with the video camera that was discovered inside of Jennifer and Skylar's house. It was the Hawks video camera, and they had used it over the past couple of years to document their travels out on the ocean. And so when the police acquired this video camera, they played the tape that was inside of it. And at first, the tape shows Jackie filming the inside of the well-deserved yacht, and she's talking about how sad it was that this is probably one of the last times they'll be inside of this boat. But she and Tom are so happy because they've found buyers who are going to take great care of this boat, and they're excited about the future. They're excited about their grandchild. And then suddenly, this footage of Jackie inside of the boat just totally cuts, and it jumps to Skylar and Jennifer at Thanksgiving dinner that year, playing with their daughter and just having this great time, meaning just days after Jennifer and Skylar murdered Tom and Jackie in the worst way imaginable, they took their camera and just began using it for their own lives, recording their own life over the memories of Tom and Jackie. Jennifer and Skylar truly didn't care at all about what they had just done. Alonzo would ultimately be sentenced to 20 years in prison. He would have gotten a much more severe sentence, but because he provided all of the details of what happened and he was promised a reduction in sentence, he was only given 20 years. Jennifer would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and John Kennedy and Skylar were sentenced to death.
This episode is called Deadly Tourist. In the summer of 2001, Arthur Laib sat inside a traditional German beer garden with his family. The middle-aged man lived on Vancouver Island in Canada, where he worked as a house painter. But now he was on his dream vacation in Germany, visiting relatives that he hadn't seen for years. He'd been looking forward to this trip for ages, and he was having a total blast. Arthur felt grateful to be on this vacation at all. A few months earlier, he had coughed up some blood, and his wife Carol insisted that he go see their doctor on Vancouver Island. The doctor would tell Arthur that he was worried about lung cancer since Arthur had been a smoker when he was young. Thankfully, Arthur's chest x-rays and follow-up testing indicated he didn't have cancer, and his doctor said that it was fine for Arthur to go to Germany and enjoy his trip. And his cough actually cleared up completely a few days before he left for the trip. Arthur took a big swig of his beer and then thought about how great it felt to sit down and relax after a full day of walking all over the city. The walking was actually the only part of the trip that Arthur was not enjoying. They'd been on their feet so much that his lower back was starting to hurt. And so Arthur made a mental note to stop by a pharmacy on the way back to the hotel for some pain relievers or maybe a hot pad. Arthur took another big sip of his beer and then looked around at all the other tourists crowded into the beer garden. Then he nodded his head at the polka band in appreciation and then settled in, enjoying a sunny afternoon and the warm glow of a nice German beer. 2 hours later, the sun had sunk behind the trees, and Arthur stood up from the table to head back to the hotel. As he got to his feet, a shock of pain burst through his lower back. Arthur immediately sank back into his seat, very surprised. Then he tried to stand again, but every time he moved, a burning pain shot through his back and up his spine. Carol was surprised that her husband couldn't stand and asked what was wrong. Arthur told her he just needed to breathe for a second, but after a few minutes, the pain was still shooting up his back. And every time he tried to stand up, the pressure on his back was blinding. Finally, he just shook his head and told Carol he did need to go to the hospital. Something was going on with his back. She nodded, then asked their son-in-law, Brian, to run and grab their rental car. 15 minutes later, Arthur sat in the front passenger seat as Brian drove towards the hospital with Carol and Arthur's daughter, Jenny, in the back seat. Every time the car hit a bump, Arthur gritted his teeth in pain. Arthur could feel a brutal headache coming on too, and he wondered if the way he was feeling now had anything to do with that nasty cough he had back home. Finally, the car turned a corner, and Arthur saw the hospital up ahead, and not a moment too soon, because right at that moment, Arthur's vision had begun to blur, so he was leaning his head against the headrest and closing his eyes. He felt hot and achy, and his forehead was dripping with sweat. And by the time the car actually stopped, Arthur felt delirious. In fact, Arthur barely noticed as his car door opened and 2 hospital staff reached in to help him stand up. An hour later, Arthur opened his eyes and realized he was lying on his side in a hospital bed with an IV drip in his arm. Slowly, the beige room came into focus. He could hear the whirring and beeping of machines in the room, as well as conversations drifting in from the hallway. The room suddenly felt chilly, and Arthur hoped that his fever might be breaking. His headache was getting less intense too, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, he he felt like he could actually think clearly. Arthur looked down towards the foot of his bed, and he saw Carol speaking to a middle-aged doctor in a very quiet voice. When Carol noticed Arthur was awake, she smiled at him, but Arthur knew his wife well, and he knew the look she was giving him was her putting on a very brave face. Something clearly was wrong. At this point, the doctor turned to Arthur and introduced himself as Dr. Gent. He told Arthur that while he was unconscious, they'd performed a spinal tap so they could examine his spinal fluid for potential infections, and the lab work had just come back. Dr. Gent kept a neutral expression as he told Arthur that his spinal fluid had a high white blood cell count, which indicated that his body was fighting an infection. Dr. Gent suspected that Arthur had a very serious condition called bacterial meningitis, which meant that the membranes that protected his brain and spinal column were swelling. He explained that meningitis is a potentially life-threatening infection, but they had already started Arthur on antibiotics, so he should make a full recovery. Arthur felt overwhelmed by everything the doctor was saying, and he just wanted to know how long it was going to be before he felt better again. But before he could ask any questions, Dr. Gent told him to try and rest. He was going to be in the hospital for a few days at least. A week later, Arthur's daughter, Jenny, was getting ready to go to work on Vancouver Island. Jenny had decided to fly back to Canada while her father was still in the hospital, but she couldn't stop worrying about him. So far, doctors in Germany had tried 6 different antibiotics, but her dad didn't respond to any of them. He just kept getting sicker. Jenny was about to head out the door when her phone rang. She lunged for it, knowing it was the time her mother usually called from Germany. For a split second, Jenny hoped that her mom was calling to say her dad was all better, and they were just going to resume their vacation and everything was great. But as soon as Jenny picked up the phone, she could hear that her mom was crying. Carol told Jenny that the swelling in her father's brain was getting worse, and now Dr. Gent was saying that it looked like her father was going to die. Jenny had not prepared herself for the possibility of losing her dad, and she scrambled to think of some way she could help. Finally, she offered to drive over to her dad's doctor's office here on Vancouver Island to basically fill in Arthur's primary care doctor about what was going on, to see if maybe he had some ideas that the doctors in Germany had not tried yet. An hour later, Jenny fidgeted as she watched her father's doctor in Vancouver Island review her dad's scans on a computer monitor and flip through his lab results. He asked Jenny a few questions about her dad's condition, and she did her best to fill in the blanks. Finally, the doctor closed the files and turned to her, and she sat up expectantly. But he just shook his head and told Jenny that, despite her father's serious illness, his charts looked remarkably normal. The doctor told her that her dad was in good health when he left for Germany. He might have picked up a bug while on the trip, but his infection should be responding to antibiotics by now. Jenny begged the doctor to please just look one more time, and then Jenny held her breath as the doctor did pick up the lab results and looked them over one more time. Then Jenny noticed the doctor's expression change, like something had just occurred to him. Then he leaned in and he told Jenny there was one possible but highly unlikely explanation. Jenny asked him to please tell her. At this point, her family was willing to consider anything. So the doctor explained that several weeks ago, her father's blood work had shown no signs of lung cancer, and they had rejoiced. But lost in the excitement was some less positive news. Arthur's blood had tested positive for a fungal infection called Cryptococcus. A lot of people get Cryptococcus, which had existed on Vancouver Island for years, but it's usually harmless, and most people's immune systems fight it off easily. It's only dangerous for people with compromised immune systems. And Arthur's immune system at the time was fine, so the doctor didn't even tell Arthur that he had this fungal infection. Jenny asked if this fungus could cause meningitis, and the doctor nodded, but only in extremely rare cases. However, if her father's meningitis was caused by a fungal infection, he would need completely different medications than what he was receiving in Germany right now. Antibiotics cannot stop a fungal infection. If Jenny's father had fungal meningitis, that would mean that for the past few days, the treatments Arthur was receiving in Germany were doing nothing. Jenny tried to stay calm as the doctor placed a call to the hospital in Germany. If they started Arthur on antifungal medication right now, he might survive. Jenny just hoped they weren't too late. Several months later, in the early winter of 2002, an animal pathologist named Sally Lester was in her laboratory on mainland British Columbia, a few miles away from Arthur's home. She slid a glass slide under her microscope, then bent down over the eyepiece to take a look. The slide she had put under there contained tissue from the carcass of a dead porpoise that had washed up on the beach on nearby Vancouver Island. Dr. Lester focused her lens on a tiny cell that looked like a boiled egg. This kind of cell had become a familiar sight to her over the past year. These odd egg-shaped cells had been sent to Dr. Lester from veterinary clinics all around Vancouver Island. A growing number of sick dogs and cats were showing up at vet clinics with shortness of breath and discharge running from their noses. In more serious cases, the animals were having seizures. Some had mysterious lumps on their heads, and all of the animals had pockets of pus called abscesses below their eyes. Veterinarians had sent in samples of the abscess tissue to Dr. Lester so she could examine them in her lab, and every time she'd found these little yellow cells that looked like boiled eggs. She knew what the cells meant, that the animals were infected with Cryptococcus, a fungus that grew on Vancouver Island. It was common for animals and humans alike to contract Cryptococcus by inhaling the spores floating in the air. Humans and animals rarely got sick from these spores. In fact, Dr. Lester usually saw no more than maybe 6 to 10 animals with Cryptococcus infections in a year. But recently, vets on Vancouver Island had been sending her about 10 cases every single month. Dr. Lester was stumped about what could be causing the number of these infections to rise so quickly. Then, porpoises began washing up on shore, which had given Dr. Lester a very eerie feeling. Dead porpoises should rarely wash ashore, but now it was happening every few weeks. And when she began reading the porpoise autopsy reports, she started feeling even more unnerved. The porpoise's lungs had been riddled with inflammation from pneumonia. Their organs were swollen and covered in flower-like tumors. And now, as Dr. Lester looked at the slide, she realized that all this damage was being caused by a Cryptococcus infection. The porpoise's blood was loaded with the fungus. Dr. Lester sat back on her stool, feeling a knot starting to form in her gut. She knew how porpoises would have contracted the Cryptococcus spores. Since spores are airborne, the fungus would have floated out over the ocean and settled on top of the water. The porpoises would have inhaled the spores when they came up and broke the surface to breathe. What she didn't understand was why the number of cases was increasing now. Something weird was definitely going on. And then Dr. Lester had a chilling thought. If more animals are getting fungal infections, maybe more people are too. After all, we all breathe the same air. Dr. Lester picked up the phone to call the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control. She knew it was now time to get the human infectious disease authorities involved. Half an hour later, Dr. Murray Fife hung up the phone on his desk at the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control. He was the organization's head epidemiologist, and he had been absolutely swamped lately. And now, after speaking with Dr. Lester, he needed a moment to consider what she had told him about this potential outbreak of fungal infections on Vancouver Island. Dr. Fife wanted to get feedback on Dr. Lester's concerns from a colleague who lived on Vancouver Island. So he picked up the phone again, this time to call the Vancouver Island Health Authority. The microbiologist who picked up said very matter-of-factly that Dr. Lester was right. There was a definite increase in human Cryptococcus infections on Vancouver Island, but not among the patients they would normally expect. Usually, it was just people with compromised immune systems that got sick from Cryptococcus, but lately, healthy adults were getting sick from the fungus. It was bizarre and basically unheard of. It made no sense to Dr. Fife. Cryptococcus fungus had been on Vancouver Island for years, so why was it suddenly so dangerous now? He worried that something about the fungus itself was changing, and he wondered if it could even be stopped. A few days later, Dr. Fife sat in a conference room totally surrounded by piles of hospital records and feeling completely exhausted. For the last week, he and a scientist at the University of British Columbia named Karen Bartlett had been combing the region's hospital records in hopes of finding other Cryptococcus infections. His eyes hurt from hours spent reading, but they still had not figured out when the number of infections had begun to rise. Dr. Bartlett cleared her throat and looked up while holding a file above her head. Dr. Fife raised his eyebrows as she explained that this file, was the oldest human case she'd found. It was from over 2 years ago, the beginning of 1999. The patient had been in good health when Cryptococcus made her sick, just like a lot of the recent cases. A few minutes later, Dr. Bartlett gasped and handed Dr. Fife another file. It was the medical records of a lively 45-year-old mother who had started to feel lousy just a few months ago in the fall of 2001. By the time the doctors tested her for Cryptococcus, the fungus had infected her brain and she died shortly after. Dr. Fife was shocked. He'd never heard of Cryptococcus killing an otherwise healthy adult. Even Arthur Laib, who'd been on death's door in Germany last summer, he'd recovered from his infection after receiving antifungal treatment. Suddenly, the stakes in their investigation seemed much higher. Not only were healthy adults contracting Cryptococcus, but the fungus was now, apparently, deadly, and Dr. Fife had no idea why. A week later, Dr. Fife was back at his desk, feeling both amazed and horrified at the unfolding health crisis. After he and Dr. Bartlett discovered that Cryptococcus infections were killing people on Vancouver Island, they'd sent samples of the fungus to a lab for further analysis. And now Dr. Fife was staring at the test results, and they weren't at all what he expected. The fungus that was infecting the animals and the people on Vancouver Island was an entirely new kind of Cryptococcus fungus than what had been on Vancouver Island for years. Under the microscope, analysts could tell that the new Cryptococcus was a completely different species from what residents were used to. But the new strain should never have been in Vancouver Island. The newcomer strain of Cryptococcus is typically found in the bark of eucalyptus trees in Australia and other warm places. It had never been seen so far north, and especially not in a cold and damp climate like Vancouver Island. Dr. Fife wondered how a tropical fungus got so far north. There were hardly any eucalyptus trees on Vancouver Island, which meant that Dr. Fife had no idea where the fungus was hiding, or how it could even survive in this environment. Dr. Fife called Dr. Bartlett to explain the alarming lab results and admit he had no idea how to find this toxic new fungus. She paused, then told him she had an idea. She said it was time to get some boots on the ground. A week later, Dr. Bartlett stood on a residential street on Vancouver Island, surrounded by several students from a local college. These were her volunteers, and together they were going to comb the backyards and backwoods of all of Vancouver Island, searching for answers. Dr. Bartlett looked from student to student and reminded them of their objective. They would dig up soil samples and swab tree barks in the hopes that they would capture the new strain of Cryptococcus in the wild. Each student nodded and said they understood. So Dr. Bartlett divided them into teams. She sent 2 teams to collect samples around the neighborhood. Then she led her group to the first house on the street where the owner was expecting them. Dr. Bartlett was pleased to see that the homeowner, who was a middle-aged woman with tanned and sun-worn skin, was waiting in the garage. Dr. Bartlett waved as she and her volunteers walked up the driveway, and the woman led them around into her backyard. Dr. Bartlett had selected this house for a very specific reason. The homeowner, the woman, had survived a recent Cryptococcus infection. Dr. Bartlett hoped that the fungus might be found somewhere in this woman's immediate environment, but failing that, Dr. Bartlett thought that by interviewing this woman and other survivors, once she knew what they all had in common, she could use that information to track down the source of the fungus. Dr. Bartlett nodded to the students, and they fanned out into the backyard. She watched as they stooped over flower beds and scraped bark off trees, and while the students went to work, Dr. Bartlett interviewed the woman who lived there. Dr. Bartlett asked the woman where she went on a daily basis, and the woman listed off popular nature trails she liked to hike, beaches she frequented, and also the friends and family that she visited most often. Eventually, Dr. Bartlett had asked all her questions, so she thanked the woman for helping and then tucked her notes into her satchel. Then, once all her students were done taking their samples, Dr. Bartlett led them down the street to the next house on their list. A few days later, Dr. Bartlett sat in a conference room at the British Columbia CDC, going over her notes while she waited for Dr. Fife. Dr. Bartlett was feeling frustrated. After canvassing what seemed like the entirety of Vancouver Island, none of the samples that she or her volunteers had collected had come back positive for spores of this new type of Cryptococcus. And her interviews with all these survivors had led nowhere too. The only thing the infected people on her list had in common was that they all lived on Vancouver Island, which of course made it impossible to pinpoint where the spores were actually coming from. They could be anywhere on the island. A few moments later, Dr. Fife walked into the office with a grim look on his face. He told Dr. Bartlett that somebody else had just shown up at a Vancouver Island hospital with a Cryptococcus infection, which brought the total of people infected to 30 so far. Dr. Bartlett had this nagging sense that the situation, which was already bad, could actually still get much worse. The summer of 2002 was approaching, and she was worried that there could be an explosion of cases as the weather got warmer. She stood and began pacing the room, racking her brain for ideas. Dr. Fife leaned against the doorframe, scratching his chin. But then Dr. Bartlett stopped pacing. She turned to Dr. Fife and asked if he'd be up for a lot of hard work and a lot of late nights. He laughed a little because he always did late nights and they always worked all the time, but Dr. Bartlett could tell, he was up for more. So Dr. Bartlett explained what she had in mind. Since her interviews with infected people had failed to get the information they needed, she suggested they start talking to the owners of infected pets. There were so many animal cases that there might be an overlap in the animals' daily schedules. It was a long shot, but there was a chance that it would help them pinpoint where the fungus spores were coming from. Dr. Fife nodded and asked Dr. Bartlett if she'd like some coffee. If they were going to spend the next few weeks driving all over Vancouver Island interviewing hundreds and hundreds of pet owners, they would need a lot more caffeine. A week later, Dr. Bartlett climbed out of her car and knocked on the door of a house on Vancouver Island. A broad-shouldered woman with big brown eyes answered the door, and Dr. Bartlett followed her into the kitchen. This was the 24th pet owner that Dr. Bartlett had interviewed in person, so at this point, she basically had her questions memorized. She began by asking where the pet owner regularly took her dog. And the woman gave predictable answers, like hiking trails and restaurants and friends' houses. Except this time, the broad-shouldered woman also mentioned a place called Rathtrevor Beach Provincial Park. That name stuck with Dr. Bartlett through the rest of the interview because other pet owners had mentioned it as well, and so Dr. Bartlett felt like that place might be worth looking into. About 36 hours later, Dr. Bartlett met her student volunteers at Rathtrevor Beach and told them to swab everything. And 2 weeks after submitting those samples, Dr. Bartlett and Dr. Fife had a startling realization. Fir trees all over Rathtrevor Beach tested positive for the new deadly fungus, and so the air in this park contained huge quantities of spores. And once Dr. Fife and Dr. Bartlett looked into this park further, the explanation for why this was became clear. Because of its location, the weather at Rathtrevor Beach was unlike the rest of Vancouver Island. It was warmer and enjoyed a drier, more Mediterranean climate. In other words, it was the perfect place for a fungus that prefers the warm, dry air of Australia rather than the typically chilly and wet Canada. So anybody who stopped at that park or just lived near it would have been breathing in these spores day in and day out. And most of the people who had contracted this infection were eventually found to have gone into or near this park. In the summer of 2002, Dr. Fife posted signs at Rathtrevor Beach Park warning people about the danger posed by this fungus. However, the park was not closed because Dr. Bartlett and her students eventually found spores in several other spots on Vancouver Island as well. So they realized there was really no way to actually contain the outbreak because clearly it basically had spread all around the island. Between 1999 and 2006, 165 human cases of Cryptococcus infections were reported in British Columbia. In total, 8 people died. As for Arthur Laib, he recovered from the disease once his hospital in Germany put him on that antifungal medication, and he was ultimately able to return to work, but his wife Carol says he's not quite as active as he used to be. Nobody knows how this fungus arrived on Vancouver Island, But the spores can live on surfaces for many, many years. So it could have been transported by humans, or wind currents coming up from the tropics, or even by porpoises that migrated across the ocean. Today, scientists are still working to find a way to prevent this infection, but currently, most scientists think there's really nothing we can do until humans and animals just naturally develop immunity to the disease.